This evening we are in the book of Acts, chapter 22. Acts 22. We recall what we read. We read through the first 16 verses of Acts 22 last Wednesday night. Paul is beginning his sermon to the mob in Jerusalem. He's reminding the mob that he was a Jew. He is a Jew, born in Tarsus. He was raised under the law of Moses. And in fact, he was a very strict adherent to the law of Moses. He was a Pharisee. He was taught by Gamaliel, who is a famous Pharisaical teacher. He persecuted Jesus Christ. But the reason why he stopped was because he saw Jesus on the road to Damascus. Jesus spoke to him and he told him that he was the one who was being persecuted. Paul needed to stop. Paul needed to go to the city, be told what he was to do. Ananias came and restored his sight and said, "Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins," calling on the name of the Lord. And that's where we ended last week. We talked about Paul's conversion. But as we know, that's not the end of the story. And that's never the end of the story for a Christian. For becoming a Christian is only the first step. Now we've got to live the way Christ wants us to live. So let's read 17 through 21. And we'll start with Naomi and then go to Henry and around one verse each.
When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance.
And the sound of his saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, as you will not receive your testimony concerning me."
And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you.
And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, consenting to his death, and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him.
And he said to me, "Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles."
So, Paul, later on, we don't know when this is. This is actually the only chapter where we get this part of the story. We do not get that in Acts chapter 9. We won't get that in Acts chapter 26, which will be Paul's third account of his conversion. We don't even get that in Galatians chapter 2, Galatians 1 and 2, which Paul is defending himself to the Galatians and sort of gives an account of his conversion. We get nowhere do we get verses 17 and 18 and onwards. We don't get an account of this. This is Paul's telling of this part of the story. He was in Jerusalem. And what was he told? Well, he went into a trance, and what was he told?
To get out of Jerusalem because they wouldn't accept it.
Get out of Jerusalem, for they wouldn't listen. Sounds familiar. Paul's in Jerusalem right now, and what's happening to him? They're not listening to him. And remember, at this time, though, it was a slightly different circumstance. What was the difference in circumstances closer to Paul's conversion, whereas opposed to now? He sort of gives an idea in what he says in verse 20.
Well, they didn't listen to him before because he had been killing Christians.
Yes. He was acknowledging that they weren't listening because he had killed Christians before. So, hold on, I'm now supposed to believe you that you are a Christian and I'm not to convert to Christ? That was a very ample reason why people wouldn't listen to him to turn to Christ. Maybe they were afraid of him. Remember in Acts 9, the brethren in Jerusalem, it took Barnabas to convince them that Saul was a Christian. They thought Saul was an imposter. He was playing the part of a Christian so that he could earn their trust, get in among them, and then he would arrest them and have them brought to jail and or killed. It took Barnabas for them to understand that. But it also would have proved an impediment to try to convince people in Jerusalem that he had changed and that they needed to come to Christ because of what he had done. So Jesus said, "Get out of Jerusalem. I'm going to send you to the Gentiles." And I note in our outline that this gave a logical reason for what Paul's work was. He couldn't preach in Jerusalem, and so he had to go someplace. Well, the only logical place is to send him to the Gentiles. Because he was unable to really be in Jerusalem, it gave him ample opportunity to travel, allowed him to quickly preach Christ's death, burial, and resurrection at this time. It allowed him to teach the gospel. But when he said that I was going to go to the Gentiles, what do you think that would have done to the people listening to him right then?
They're not happy.
They wouldn't be happy. Because remember, they're Jews. Hatred of the Gentiles. And so he infuriates the mob by saying he was sent to the Gentiles. Remember, they had stirred up, the mob was stirred up because they thought Paul was against the Jews. And one way you'd be against the Jews is you're for the Gentiles. Not only are you teaching against the law of Moses, you're teaching us that we have to accept Gentiles. And Moses said we weren't to accept other nations. So this would have infuriated the mob that he was sent to the Gentiles, and that's evident by what we get in verses 22 and 23. We'll go to Henry and then Bill for those two verses.
And they listened to him until the word of the day, the rest of their voices, and said, I work with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live.
And as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air.
And that's it. We'll get the rest in a second. So they heard him up to that point. That's a lot like what happens sometimes when we're talking to people. They will listen up to a point. They probably weren't too upset with him up to this point. They'd let him talk. But once he started talking about the Gentiles, that was enough. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. They didn't want to hear about that. So they started. I get this picture. It's almost like a child when they throw a tantrum. A small child when they throw a tantrum. They just all of a sudden they stop listening. No one can reason with them, and they just start throwing things. A small child will grab any toy they want, just start throwing them around unless the parent can get control of the child. The child's just going to continue doing it. Well, what they do, they took off their clothes, threw dust in the air. They're acting like children here. That's not how grown men and women should act. We can disagree with people. We can even be angry with people. But we shouldn't have that reaction. But this is how volatile the situation was. That they were ready to kill Paul. They were just looking for a reason. And I believe that's probably one of the reasons why they just let him speak. They let him speak so that he could get himself into trouble. And then they could come along and say, that's the reason we want him dead. They wanted to do the same thing to Jesus, but Jesus wouldn't speak. Jesus let them convict him. Jesus didn't convict himself. Paul didn't convict himself either. But they were hoping that Paul would convict himself. Say something that they could bring to the chief captain and get Paul executed. So now we've got this mob situation here. And the chief captain has sort of been standing off in the background, letting Paul talk to this mob. But the mob's getting very unruly. And so let's get the rest of the chapter, 24 through 30. We'll start with Tammy. And why don't we read two verses each.
The commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, and said that he should be examined under scourging, so that he might know why they shouted so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who stood by, Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?
When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen. So the tribune came and said to him, Tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, Yes.
And the commander answered, We are not the son and obtained this citizenship. And Paul said, But I was born a citizen. Then immediately those who were about to examine him with stole from him. And the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had defrauded him.
But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set him before them.
So, chief captain's got this mob. And obviously, now remember, Paul was speaking in the Hebrew tongue. That's what we had from the beginning of the chapter. Or at the end of chapter 21. So it's most likely that the chief captain here didn't understand what Paul was saying. The chief captain was a Roman. And so Paul was speaking in a different language, sort of like Henry on my Saturday night classes. He speaks the last 15 minutes of the class in Mandarin. And I have no idea what he's saying. He's supposed to be saying, summarizing the lesson that we had tonight, but I have no idea if he's doing that. But sometimes people will start to laugh, and I know Henry said something funny, or someone said something funny, but I have no idea what it was. Well, the mob here has reacted in such a way that chief captain comes along and says, oh, he must have said something that got them angry. Scourge him now so that he tells us what that is. He wants him to confess to why the mob is saying what it is, or doing what it is. What does Paul do before they start to scourge him? Or at least maybe during the scourging?
We told him he was a Roman. If we
That-
they were allowed to scourge him.
That, of course, that was a rhetorical question Paul knew the answer to. Roman citizens in the first century had unique rights. Unique rights in that they were entitled to a trial. No one else was entitled to a trial. If you were from another nationality, theoretically, you could be convicted of a crime with no trial, you could be jailed without charge, and you could be beaten without charge. Not so with a Roman. A Roman could not be jailed without a charge. So that the chief captain's already in trouble because he really doesn't have a charge to keep Paul on. Couldn't be beaten without a charge. And we knew that already. We knew Paul was a Roman citizen. We knew that you could get in trouble for that. Tammy, do you want to get Acts 16, verse 37?
But Paul said to them, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now do they put us out secretly? No, indeed, let them come themselves and get us out.
Remember, this is in Philippi. This is one of the places we learned Paul was a Roman citizen, but we knew that the Romans would get in trouble for beating a Roman citizen without charge. And so the chief captain asked, how are you Roman? Because he knew he was a Jew. What was Paul's answer?
He's been born a Roman.
He'd been born a Roman. So that tells us something. One of Paul's parents was Roman. One was a Jew because he was born a Jew. One was a Roman because he was born Roman. And so we know that it's similar to Timothy, if you recall. Timothy had a Greek father and a Jewish mother. Knowing the patriarchal society, that's probably what happened with Paul, just because of what Roman citizenship. I don't know whether it was conferred on children because they were mothers. You'd be a Jew from birth no matter who your parent was. I'm not sure whether you'd be a Roman from birth if your mother was a Roman or whether it had to be your father, but we can speculate all we want. One of Paul's parents was Roman, and one was Jewish. Paul was born Roman. How did the council, the chief captain, how did he get his citizenship? verse 28.
You bought it.
He bought it. He would become what we call a naturalized citizen. So if people come from another country, they have another citizenship, they come to Canada, they live so long, they have the opportunity to be citizens, and that comes with a price. There is a monetary sum that has to be paid, plus other things that have to be met as well. He paid for this citizenship. Paul says, I was born. So that shows the difference, even between the chief captain and Paul. So verse 29 says, they didn't beat him. They didn't beat him. In fact, they were very afraid because they had illegally bound a Roman citizen. The Jews can get someone into trouble, and can get a Roman into trouble without really knowing it. Roman governors needed to be more careful. He thought in the beginning he was an Egyptian. He wasn't a Roman. Then he thought he was a Jew, which of course he was, but he didn't bother to consider any other fact. And then he found out he was a Roman, and that got him to be afraid. So, verse 30 says, the next day, chief captain wanted to find out what the charge was. Because if he didn't have a charge, he would have to let him go. That would cause other problems for him too, because of course he had this mob. And so he desperately wanted a charge in order to keep Paul in jail and prevent this mob from getting out of control. But before he brought him to the council, he let us out of his chains. He didn't deserve to have that happen. He wasn't being prosecuted as a murderer. And he commanded the chief priests and the Jewish council to come and lay their charges. This time there was going to be no mob. This was similar to what we call a preliminary hearing. And he brought Paul before them, and he wanted the Jewish council, not the mob, to give what their charges were. Any comments or questions up to this point?
I was thinking, Paul suffered tremendously as a Christian, but he shows the example here that we can use the laws of the land to our advantage if so be. And that's not saying his faith was any less.
No. Paul did exactly what he told the Romans in Romans 13. Obey the government. Obey the government means hold the government to account for their own laws. If the government tells us we have the right to deduct money off of our taxes, why does a Christian come along and say, well, I have to pay more tax than everyone else? No, we have to pay the tax that we owe. We do not have to pay. We could voluntarily if we want to. I noticed that at the bottom of the tax forms, if I would like to donate part of my refund to help pay down the Ontario or federal debt, I could do that. I chose not to. But the government, if they allow us to deduct things off our taxes, and we can legally take those deductions, there's nothing against a Christian doing that. If we are in another country and we are arrested, we have the right to call our embassy and have our embassy maybe help deal with some things. We have the right for that. We have many rights that are given to us by our governments, and it is not wrong for us to use them. Paul's going to further use them over these next 2 years, and he's going to use the laws to his advantage. There's nothing wrong with that either. If the government writes a law that is to our advantage, let's take advantage of it. As I said before, the government has given tax laws that are favorable to churches, and sometimes will even give some of our tax money back. Why would we not take advantage of what the government has given us? Sometimes maybe we live in a country that requires churches to pay taxes. Well, we give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God's. But let's not give the things to Caesar the things which are not Caesar's. And let's use the laws of the land to our advantage where we can, and obey them in all places. That was a good point, Bill. Anything else? Well, we have time. Let's go into chapter 23. I handed out pages at the back. We'll read through the first 11 verses. That's probably where we'll finish off this evening. Acts 23, 1 through 11, we're to Naomi. Why don't we read 3 verses each through verse 11.
And looking intently at the council, Paul said, Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. The high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. And Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck?
Those who stood by said, You require God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, Master, that he was the high priest. For it's written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of the people. But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and another Pharisees, he cried out to the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, and being judged.
As he said this, there occurred a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there occurred a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him.
Now when there arose,
And as the great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks.
One more verse there, verse 11.
But on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also.
So here we have Paul's defense. This is his second defense, really. The first one was before the mob, and that didn't work. The second one now is going to be before the Jewish council the next day. Here again, Paul declares that he is innocent in verse 1, which of course he was. And he says, what does he say about his conscience before God? In verse 1.
he has a good conscience.
He had a good conscience before God. From when to when?
Well, from that day, he said he lived my life.
Yeah. He lived with a good conscience all his life. And that's maybe funny for us, or maybe a little troublesome for us maybe, to consider, because we know Paul was a persecutor. We know he was wrong when he was a persecutor. We know he was in sin when he was a persecutor. Paul is not saying here that he never sinned. That's not what he was saying. But what he is saying is that everything he did thinking it was right. That tells us one thing about our conscience. That just because one feels good about themselves doesn't prove they're right. Paul thought he was right when he was persecuting Christians, but he was wrong. His conscience was clear, but his actions were wrong. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Tammy, you want to get verses 3 and 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4.
But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. For I know of nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges me is the Lord.
Paul knows who is going to be the ultimate judge of his actions. It's not the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. It's not himself. We cannot be judged by ourselves to be right in and of ourselves. We can judge ourselves. We're going to be talking about judging, the Lord willing, this Sunday. We're going to be talking about judging ourselves and judging others. But just because we've made a judgment that something is right or something is wrong, doesn't make it right or wrong. It's only right or wrong if God says it's right or wrong, and God's going to be the ultimate judge. We can make a bad judgment, whether we approve of something that God does not approve of, or disapprove of something that God does approve of. Those are bad judgments. And we will be brought before the Lord to face those judgments. Paul was saying, I will trust the Lord. The Lord is going to be my judge. But when he said that he felt right, he was correct. And that's why Paul didn't really trust himself when it came to judgments, because he had judged his own character poorly before. He trusted in God and trusted in God's word. Paul was affirming that while now he preached Jesus, he believed he was doing God's will. In other words, he was saying, I still have a good conscience. I'm doing the opposite of what I was doing before, but I'm still doing that in good conscience. And who does this, what is that saying when Paul says this? Who gets mad at him? And what does he do?
High priest gets mad, strikes him.
High priest strikes him. In the wrong chapter, that's why I couldn't find it. The high priest strikes him. Who's the high priest?
Ananias?
Ananias. I do not know if this is the same Ananias from when Jesus was being... I guess that's Annas, not Ananias. It's Caiaphas and Annas. That would tell me something. It's not the same. Names are very similar in Jewish times. This is not Annas. This is Ananias, so this is another chief priest. Caiaphas would have been the chief priest in the early part of Acts. Remember, this is 30 years later. Whether this is his son, grandson, or somebody else. This is Ananias. Stood by, struck him on the mouth. How did Paul react to that?
Not too kindly.
Not too kindly. I would say. What did he say? Depends on the version as to what was said. What did he say?
The New King James says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall.
Yeah. Not very kind words. What he was calling Ananias out on was his hypocrisy. He was saying, you're judging me according to the law, and yet you struck me contrary to the law. They weren't allowed to just go out and strike people because they were angry. They weren't allowed to hate. They weren't allowed to be angry without cause. Paul had said nothing to Ananias that should have caused Ananias to strike him. But, alright, so we have Ananias, he got mad without cause, struck Paul. Paul said, basically, you're a hypocrite, God will strike you. And what was the response of the crowd?
They were standing up for the high priest.
They were standing up for the high priest, and they said, don't you know who you just struck? It's like walking up and striking Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. People are going to say, don't you know who you just hit? It'd be even worse if we struck Donald Trump. I don't know what he'd do if we did that. We'd certainly be in a lot of trouble. But, person in power. Don't you know who you just struck? And then we have Paul's response. It's another pithy response of Paul. I didn't know he was the high priest. He certainly wasn't acting like it. Do you expect the high priest to go around hitting people? Sort of like the preacher. You expect the preacher going around hitting people? No, you don't expect that of the preacher. I'm not comparing the preacher to the high priest in the sense of hierarchy, but same sort of comparison. He wasn't, his actions weren't showing that he was a high priest. And in fact, Paul was quoting here, Exodus chapter 22. Naomi, you want to get Exodus 22 and verse 28.
You shall not revile God nor curse the ruler of your people.
This was another one of those commands the children of Israel weren't to curse the ruler of the people. Whoever it was, they weren't to curse and they weren't to rebuke or speak evil of. The ruler of their people. And the high priest would have been the ruler of the people. How could I have known that he was the high priest? Because he wasn't behaving like it. Now Paul does something very humorous, if you understand Paul's humor. He notices what about the council that's sitting, according to verse 6.
Half of them were Sadducees, the other half was Pharisees.
Yeah. Half were Sadducees, half were Pharisees. So Paul had an idea. You know, right now they're all against me. Everyone hates me. I know how I can turn the tables on this council. All he said was, "Men and brethren, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee." All right, that would have already edged the Sadducees a little bit. It's because I'm preaching about the resurrection of the dead that I'm here. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, and Paul knew it. He didn't have to say this. He could have come along and tried to say any other thing. But he knew, if I can split this council up, they'll stop ganging up on me. And so he didn't tell a lie. He was standing before them because he preached Christ. Christ raised from the dead. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in spirits. If we remember from Matthew 22, how they tried to trick Jesus with the woman who had 7 husbands. They didn't believe in the resurrection, so they thought, oh, we'll concoct this idea, this absurd idea where this woman had 7 husbands, and when she's raised in heaven, whose wife shall she be? She had 7 husbands. It was a ridiculous scenario that they had concocted. And Jesus answered it simply, "You do err not knowing the Scriptures. Don't you know that in heaven they are neither neither married nor given in marriage? There's going to be no marriage in heaven." And that's how he ended it. But the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, but the Pharisees, they believed in it all. And so what the Pharisees in verse 9 say?
Nothing wrong with this guy.
Nothing wrong with this guy. We find no fault in him. We like him. We thought he was like them. Now remember, there were some of the Pharisees that did become Christians. I'm not saying that they were these people, but some of the Pharisees did become Christians. It should have been easier for them. They at least believed in the resurrection of the dead. So it wouldn't be completely implausible for them to believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. The Sadducees, it was a different matter. They had to overcome this idea that we don't have a spirit. That when we die, that's it. That there is no resurrection. The Pharisees believed. So the Pharisees decided, this guy's not so bad. Perhaps an angel spoke to him. Sort of poking at the Sadducees. Perhaps an angel spoke to him. That's why he's speaking these things. And if an angel spoke to him or another spirit spoke to him, we can't fight against God. Let him go. It's an amazing thing what Paul did. Paul recognized the situation and got the council to turn on itself. Again, Paul did nothing wrong here. Little mischievous, yes. Nothing wrong. So the chief captain had to go in again. Paul had got this mob yesterday mad at him. Now he got this council mad at him too, or at least split. So the chief captain had to come in and rescue Paul again and take him back to the fortress. Paul's getting into a lot of trouble. And what did Jesus tell him? Because if you have a red letter Bible, you'll know that Jesus is speaking here in verse 11. What did Jesus tell him when Paul went back to prison?
Told him to take courage.
Take courage? Why?
Because he was also going to have to speak up for Christ in Rome.
Yes, Jesus told him that his life was not going to end here. Now, up to this point, Paul, we really do believe from his actions in chapter 21 and chapter 22 and chapter 23, Paul believed he was going to die for Christ here in Jerusalem. Must have been a shock when Jesus told Paul, "You're not done. You've testified of me here in Jerusalem. You're going to testify of me in Rome as well." Up to this point, we do have no record of Paul going to Rome. He had a letter to the Romans, which he had already written. Aquila and Priscilla, remember, his friends, had been in Rome. He knew people who were in Rome. But he had never been himself as a Christian, as far as we can read. We read no place on our maps that we were looking at that Paul went to Rome. And so Jesus saying, you're going to testify of me in Rome, bear witness of me in Rome. Now, Paul didn't know how this was going to happen. Would it be a dangerous trip to Rome? Now, we know that that was true as well later on in this book. He didn't know that he was going to be in prison for 2 years. He didn't know he was going to have to face corrupt governors, that he was going to have to face shipwreck. But he did know that if Jesus said he was going to testify in Rome, he was going to testify in Rome. That God's providence will rule. He didn't know how it would work. He didn't know how long it was going to take. But he knew it was going to happen. And so, if Jesus were to come and tell us, be of good cheer, you're going to do this, this, and this. Well, people would be very happy if Jesus would do that. Now, he doesn't do that. He doesn't promise that for us today. Paul was an apostle. We are not apostles. Jesus is apostles today. There are no spiritual gifts today. Jesus speaks through his word today. But this would have perked Paul up. He had been fearless up to this point, but sometimes you can be fearless when you think you're going to die anyway. Because no matter what you do, if I don't speak, I'm going to die. So I might as well go down kicking. Might as well go down fighting. Now, this would have perked Paul up. That be of good cheer, you're going to go to Rome. You're not going to die here in Jerusalem. And so, that will end where we are tonight. Lord willing, next Wednesday we will take up with verse 12. Paul is going to be facing danger. The Jews aren't done. They want him dead. And they're going to concoct a plan to kill him.